And thank you for doing this. So the first question I had is local in scope. Maine, in the national view, is seen as kind of a vacation land, but in reality, a lot of communities in our state are suffering with the results of deindustrialization. We have a lot of mill towns that have where the mills have closed. A lot of people in poverty and turning to addiction. So, what are your specific economic visions to reverse the course of rural America as it's on right now?
Yeah, I have the kind of a longer term approach, which is ending the addiction to war, to the unraveling the war machine, which is driving the inflation in this country and driving the destruction of the middle class. I'm going to rein in the Fed also, so that the policies of quantitative easing followed uh, by high interest rates, which is used to pump money out of the middle class and out of an equity out of the middle class toward the big uh, investment houses and banks, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the big banks. We're going to have a rational policy, and I'm going to end the chronic disease epidemic, which is the biggest cost. That's now 5 times our military cost. A lot of people are suffering from chronic disease in Maine. We only 6% of our population had chronic disease when my uncle was president. Today, 60% does. It's costing us $4.3 trillion. Diabetes, for example, which is epidemic in Maine. When I was a kid, a typical pediatrician would see one case of diabetes in his lifetime. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks into his office is diabetic or pre-diabetic, and we know why it is. We no other country has anything like this. We have we're mass poisoning our people, and particularly this generation of children, which are all suffering from autoimmune disease, neurological diseases, depression, mental illness, obesity, et cetera. Suicide is now the second most common death among Americans under 35. Addiction, we killed 106,000 people from overdoses last year. It's double the number of people who died in the 20-year Vietnam War. And we got to start treating this as a crisis and started healing people. We have a whole generation that's feeling dispossessed, that's alienated, that's marginalized and depressed, and has very little hope for their own future, but also is just disconnected from any feeling of community.
And I want to touch upon what you're saying a little bit about defense and American involvement in foreign wars. You've definitely called for cutting the military budget substantially. You said the military spending is a constant drain on our nation's vitality. What about if Russia does win in Ukraine and Putin continues his mission to recreate the old borders of the Soviet Union because of a lack of American aid? Do you think that would drain our nation's vitality as well?
Well, I don't think Putin wants to conquer Europe. He can barely conquer Ukraine, which is the poorest country in Europe. There is no evidence whatsoever that Putin wants to reestablish the old Soviet borders. Putin was provoked to go into Ukraine. I'm not saying that. I'm not defending Putin. He had other options, but he made it very clear that he wanted to leave Ukraine. And the one thing he asked for is that we would commit not to put NATO into Ukraine. He signed an agreement with President Zelensky in April of 2022, in which Zelensky agreed to not bring NATO in, and Putin began withdrawing his troops. He didn't, in fact, when Donbass and Lugansk voted to join Russia, he said no. Oh, he didn't want them. He wanted them to stay in Ukraine. The only reason that he went in was to try to get an agreement that NATO would not go into Ukraine, and that's understandable. That is a
Do
legitimate.
you acknowledge that American aid and American military spending is part of the reason that Ukraine, one of the poorest countries in Europe, as you said, is able to defend itself against Russia for as long as it has?
I think without that aid, they would have signed an agreement, and there'd be 600,000 Ukrainian kids who would be alive today who did not need to die, and Ukraine would be a lot better off because Donbass and Lugansk would still be part of Ukraine, and the
And
Russian troops would not be in the country. And you know, we made them tear up that agreement. Joe Biden sent Boris Johnson over after Zelensky had negotiated a peace agreement, refereed by Naftali Bennett from Israel and by Prime Minister Erdogan from Turkey. They all sat down in Istanbul. They initialed it. Putin initialed it. Zelensky initialed it. Putin was withdrawing all troops from Ukraine. But we wanted that war. And Biden sent Boris Johnson over and forced Zelensky to tear up that agreement. And that's why those 600,000 kids died. They didn't need to. And by the way, my own son fought in Ukraine. He joined the Foreign Legion. He fought in the Kharkiv offensive. And the people that he fought with are now dead. And they didn't need to die. And that was, you know, of course, it's Putin's fault, but it was America's fault too, for insisting stupidly that NATO be pushed into Ukraine. We gave our word in 1992 that that would not happen. When Gorbachev dismantled the Soviet Union, the only thing he asked us is we wouldn't, after we put 450,000 troops into Germany and reunited East and West Germany, and the Russians moved out their troops out and let our troops go in. The one thing Gorbachev asked is that we would not move NATO to the east. And we did it anyway. We moved it into 14 countries, 1,000 miles to the east. And the one red line that the Russians always said is you can't move it into Ukraine. We've been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. We walked away from 2 nuclear weapons treaties with the Soviets, the 2 intermediate missile treaties, and we went and put nuclear ready Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland. 12 minutes from Moscow, we could decapitate the entire Soviet leadership in 12 minutes. If we put those same systems in Ukraine, we can do it in 4 minutes. Think about that. You know, when the Russians tried to put missiles in Cuba, we said that's too close, and we're going to go to war with you if you do it. And we drove them out. And I was, you know, my family was part of that. I remember the missile crisis very well. My uncle solved the missile crisis, and my father met with Ambassador Dobrin, and he explained the reason we put the missiles in Cuba is because you have missiles in Turkey on our border. So my uncle, in a secret agreement, agreed to pull the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey if the Russians would pull their missiles out of Cuba. And we solved it. And we stayed out of Europe with our missile systems for all these decades. And then we had President Trump and President Obama go and put Aegis missile systems right near the Russian border and walk away from the 2 nuclear weapons treaties. And then the Biden administration insisted on putting NATO in Ukraine, which is a red line for Russia.
Mr. Kennedy, I want to move on to a different topic that has been dominating college campuses when the students were still on campus, which is the rise of anti-Semitism. And I want to go over some comments that you made a year ago. You said COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. Do you still believe in what you said, and do you acknowledge that that kind of statement falls into a anti-Semitic trope that goes back to the Black Plague?
I mean, the irony is, and at the same time, I'm being called anti-Semitic, which of course is a joke. I'm also being called a Zionist. So you know, somebody's got to make up their mind. All I was doing was quoting an NIH-funded paper that anybody can look up, and I wasn't making something up. I
But do
was
you acknowledge that that specific trope that Jews are somehow have different immunity than other people is something that has been used by anti-Semitic movements throughout history?
all I was doing was quoting a paper that was funded by the United States government. That's a peer-reviewed publication that said, well, of course, all races are different. There are ethnically targeted bioweapons. I never said that COVID was one of those. What I said about COVID, which I just quoted, the findings of the paper that showed that certain races were more susceptible because the docking site on the COVID virus that docks with the ACE2 receptors in people's lungs was more compatible with certain races than with others. The races that it was least compatible with were people from Finland. The second most was Ashkenazi Jews. The third most was Chinese nationals. It was most compatible with Blacks, with people from Africa, and with Caucasians. And, this is a scientific study. It's not a racist statement. It's just the truth. And, if you think we shouldn't talk about the truth, then I think that's an
So you stand by
press.
your comment. Okay. I just want to move on because we don't have much time. We're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision. First, tell me a little bit about your feelings on the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, and what federal restrictions or lack thereof there should be regarding abortion.
I supported Roe v. Wade. I think it should be a woman. Listen, I fought more and harder for medical freedom and bodily autonomy probably than anybody in this country. And I believe that it should be a woman's choice to whether or not to abort her baby. I think every abortion is a tragedy. I think we ought to do as much as we can to avoid abortions, particularly 52% of abortions are women say that economics played a role in their decision. And I don't think that should ever be the case. I don't think we should ever that a woman should ever be forced to terminate a pregnancy because of economic considerations.
What national legislation?
Let me just finish what I'm saying. I think that after the fetus becomes viable outside of the womb, that the state has an escalating interest in protecting that life.
And moving on to your family, the Kennedys obviously are known for rallying behind campaigns when a member of your family runs for office. What do you think about your messaging has caused your family to choose, or many members of your family to endorse Joe Biden?
Well, I have a big family. I've got 105 cousins and nieces and nephews, and I don't know whether half of them are for me, but it would be something like that. I have many members of the family who are working on my campaign. My cousin Anthony Schreiber is running my Florida operation. But there's other members of my family's very, very close to President Biden. I've known President Biden for 40 years. We have close personal relations. There's 5 members of my family that are working for the administration, and many of them don't agree with me on a number of issues, on censorship. They don't agree with me on Ukraine and other issues as well. And I come from a family where we were raised with the idea that we should be able to debate each other. We were encouraged to debate each other every night at the dinner table, but also that we could debate with passion, with knowledge, but also that we could love each other even when we disagree with each other. And I love my family. I feel loved by them. And I wish the same thing could happen for our country, that we could disagree on issues without hating on each other.
And of course, you're running to win. But if you do take enough of a vote away from either President Biden or former President Trump, and are a major reason that one of them wins, how do you think that would reflect on your legacy?
I listen, I'm running for president. There's a lot of people in this country who do not, 80% of the country says they don't want to have to choose between President Biden and President Trump. And I'm giving them another option. I have higher favorability ratings than anybody who's running right now. I am doing better with young people than anybody who's running right now. I'm doing better with independent voters than anybody who's running. And I'm doing better, particularly with people who have not voted in other elections, but they're coming back into the electoral process because they were disgusted. They didn't like having to choose between the lesser of two evils. And they're coming back now to vote and vote for me. I right now, just so that you know, our polling shows, which is the best polling on this issue, that I take a slightly larger number of votes away from President Trump than President Biden. President Trump Biden cannot win the election, according, the biggest poll taken was the Zogby poll, which is 10 times the size of any other poll. And that poll shows that if there's in a three-way race, if the election happened today, that President Trump wins. If I'm in it, if I get out, President Trump wins 2 extra states, Maine and Virginia. But I pretty much am, poll after poll has shown that large numbers of my supporters are voting for me, who have completely withdrawn from the political process, and they're coming back in to vote for me. And I think they ought to have an alternative choice, but I intend to win this election.
So last question, and it just has to do with trade. Would you call yourself a protectionist, or would you say you're in favor of free trade in the same vein as President Clinton or President Reagan before that?
I would say I'm for fair trade. I think free trade implies that other nations ought to be able to outcompete us by paying low amounts to workers or by cheating on the environmental issues. And I don't think that that's true. So I'm for free markets and fair trade, but not for just unhinged trade, which would provoke and promote a race to bottom, of bad behavior by nations all over the world, and it will export all of our industry, which we've seen happen.
So does that mean you would support something like President Biden's tariffs on Chinese EVs?
Yeah, you know what? I would. I'm going to look at that case by case. That's the only way to do it. It's the only way to do it.
Great. Well, I think that's our time. Thanks so much, Mr. Kennedy. I really appreciate you making the time to do this.
Happy to be with you.
Thank you. And is there anything else you want to add?
No.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye.